The US national debt is already over $36 trillion. That's about 125% of America's GDP by some measures. And of course, America's GDP is the biggest in the world. Trump's big, beautiful bill, which rolls over tax cuts and adds more, will add another $4 trillion to that. Annual budget deficits are already over 6% and forecast to be over 7% for the rest of the decade and beyond. Now, conventional economics tells us to run big deficits in a recession to pump prime the economy, but not when you're at the top of the economic cycle and with full employment, which America is. The risk, and it's huge, is that if America were to plunge into recession now, the budget deficit and national debt would explode, placing huge demands on global debt markets, which would engulf other countries, including Britain. Let's speak again to Noah Rothman. We've spoken to him before on these matters. He's a commentator, senior writer for the National Review. Noah Rothman, let me start with this. This might not be the case yet, but is America close to being on the brink of a sovereign debt crisis?
It really does depend on who you talk to and what the circumstances are in Washington. I think the general consensus is no, that the United States is not close to default on its debt.
No.
And default would trigger the kind of crisis that I think you're imagining. What we're experiencing is a slow boil. We could experience that kind of a shock, some sort of external crisis, a war, an economic downturn that's really, really sharp and that would compel Washington to do, as you said in the outset, prime the economy with a lot of deficit spending to try to increase demand because demand would dry up, et cetera, et cetera. We're not there yet, but we're seeing a lot of indications that we could be there soon. The Sell America trend over the summer should be a wake-up call in Washington, but we're not seeing that kind of reaction yet.
I think a default by America is inconceivable. America can always sell its debt. It has the dollar, after all. I think the question for me is at what price and what implications if you have to pay more and more to get your debt away, particularly since debt service in America is already running, it's a remarkable figure, at over $1 trillion a year.
Because interest rates are increasing, the price of our debt is growing. And that's the scenario that should terrify everybody. The notion that credit begins to dry up, right? That's the first sign of a debt crisis, when all of a sudden credit washes out. And we saw some of this over the course of the spring, where investors began to get very leery of American bonds. And it had everything to do with America's fiscal trajectory and the debt. The big, beautiful bill, such as it is not a serious spending reduction measure. And America's debt trajectory is projected to increase, as you say, in perpetuity. And we're going to face some real crises when it comes to America's entitlement programs. The first coming up is Medicare's hospital insurance fund, which the trustees maintain is going to reach the point of insolvency at the end of this decade. And then early in the next decade, Social Security comes due in a very similar way. And we're not going to see a collapse of the American economy in those events, most likely, but we would see a significant debt reduction and some serious trade-offs, or a significant reduction in payments of those programs, and some real serious trade-offs that Washington would have to encounter. The only thing that's missing from this equation is public outcry. Washington is not responding to the debt crisis because the public doesn't want it to respond to the debt crisis. Americans do not want cuts to their entitlement programs. Americans do not want major tax increases that could cut and cover some of these gaps. So we're experiencing a stasis in Washington because there's no underlying panic. And there could be a panic if we were to experience something like an entitlement crisis or a debt crisis, at which point I don't know if the political caste in Washington wouldn't respond to those incentives. I think they probably would, but they'd be very painful, and a lot of people would be willing to demagogue what would have to be done in that instance. I don't know how that situation would unfold and what factions would emerge victorious, but it would be a significant fight, and there would be at least some desire on the part of the American people to restore fiscal sanity. They like that paradigmatically. They don't like what we need to do in order to get there.
The worry for the rest of us is that however you cut it, the US is going to put huge demands on global capital markets to borrow. Because this year alone, it's going to refinance, never mind issuing new debt. This year alone, it's going to refinance $7 trillion dollars of existing debt. And of course, that puts pressure on the price of debt, the yield, the interest rate. And the rest of us are going to have to pay more as well. This is not an America-only problem. It has a ripple effect through global debt markets and makes sovereign debt, government borrowing, more expensive all over the world.
Most certainly. And one of my bigger fears in the near term is those conditions that you just described make it more attractive for countries that perceive themselves to be outside the American-led economic order to seize their initiatives, to exercise their prerogative, to reshape the global order in their regions. The expansionist powers that I'm thinking of are China and Russia in particular, but Iran is also outside that paradigm, and a variety of others, Venezuela, Cuba. And in the event that the United States doesn't look like it has the wherewithal necessary to project force abroad in a sustained manner, it's a very expensive prospect. That's the sort of thing that could prove very enticing to countries that resent the US-led order and want to reshape it more in their image. That, I think, is going to become an irresistible prospect for countries like China if they perceive that the United States and the West simply do not have the capacity to deter in a sustained fashion their objectives abroad. So yeah, economic crises beget other crises, geopolitical crises that have a military dimension as well. It's the sort of thing that you can't rule out.
America's already paying a bit of a risk premium in its as it borrows in its 10-year T-bills, the 10-year Treasury bills, which are a kind of global benchmark for investors. It's paying a pretty hefty yield to get that debt away. That's likely to rise if even more debt is going to flood the markets. I would have thought it's going to become very hard for, despite what Mr. Trump wants, for the Federal Reserve to do much more interest rate cutting.
Yeah, especially if the tariff regime that the president imagines comes into effect in something approaching the scale and scope that he has described it as. I'm kind of disturbed by the extent to which we saw some real attention being paid to debt yields, the 10-year debt yield, over the course of the in between the Liberation Day tariffs on April 2 and their suspension. There was a bit of a panic in financial markets, and that did begin to express itself in American political discourse. And then it just sort of went away. But the bond yields did not stop rising.
No.
The implication being that the global investor market is nowhere near comfortable with America's fiscal trajectory. And they shouldn't be, based on what's being discussed with this big, beautiful bill, for example. But the urgency around that faded very quickly, along with talk of tariffs. The tariffs are a symptom of what the global investment environment was communicating to us, what the signals they were sending to us. They were not the cause of it. So there's a little bit of exuberance in the markets when it comes to American debt that I find a little irrational. There was a moment there where we saw some sobriety peek its way through the clouds, but it has since dissipated. And I don't know when it comes back in the absence of another real serious fiscal crisis.
I mentioned in my introduction that the fear, given the size of the budget deficit alone at the moment, is that if America was to go into recession, who knows what would then, if you're running a 7% deficit when the economy has been growing for several years, what's it going to be when it stops growing? What I've not seen, is there still a pervasive fear of recession in the United States this year, or a slowing down? What is the general feeling of the course of the American economy? Because what happens there will be vital to what we then see in the debt markets, the yields and the cost of borrowing.
Yeah, during this, the Liberation Day to Unliberation Day, that little period in between Trump's massive tariffs announcement and the paring them back, there was expectation among the big banks, Goldman Sachs and others, that recession was about a 50-50 prospect in the course of the next year, this year. And it's since dissipated. Since those tariffs have been withdrawn, the investment community has a much more rosy picture of the American economy. And we've seen some indications that it's not completely unfounded. Consumer confidence in the United States is up. Employment continues to overperform expectations. We're not seeing a lot of layoffs, not yet. So the indications that would be the leading indicators of a recession just aren't there. And so a lot of that fear has dissipated for the time being. Doesn't mean it cannot return, and doesn't mean once we get a look at what the Senate wants to pass with this big, beautiful bill that things change, or Donald Trump reverts to form and starts imposing massive tariffs again on the global economy. Because right now there's a court case that suggests that he doesn't have that authority. It's not vested in Congress, to him in Congress. But that issue is stayed and it has to go to the Supreme Court. So even that's up in the air. There's a lot of uncertainty. But right now, the banking community seems to be much more confident in the trajectory of the economy in the course of the next 12 months than they were a month or two ago.
Well, I suppose in a gloomy period, that's some kind of good news. You mentioned earlier circumstances which could come together to push this issue we're talking about of debt and deficits up the agenda. But at the moment, I think what you're saying, and other people tell me the same, is that there's no real mood in Washington, as things stand, to stop this, what some would call fiscal madness.
Yeah, there never is. It's very unfortunate. And once you get to Washington, Elon Musk, I have a lot of things to say about Elon Musk and Doge. But one of the things you can say charitably to his initiative is that he said, I'm going to Washington to cut spending. And then he went to Washington and cut spending. That doesn't happen very often. It's the sort of thing that you give him a little bit of credit for. The problem is that he went on this journey of discovery where he experienced all the things that conservatives have known for a very long time. At the outset of his tenure, for example, early in before Inauguration Day in December, there was a dispute between Donald Trump and Elon Musk over an omnibus spending bill. Donald Trump wanted Republicans in Congress to raise the debt limit for the next 4 years, so he would never have to worry about spending in Washington over the course of his term. Meanwhile, Elon Musk was actually trying to cut spending and trying to make it more difficult to increase our debt obligations. And those two issues were at odds. But we were facing the prospect of a shutdown at the time because of this impasse. And Elon Musk said to himself, well, maybe it'd be great to shut down the government, because then Americans would look around and say, wow, we don't really actually need all this government in our lives, do we? That is something conservatives tell themselves about once a generation. And once a generation, they shut down the government and realize what a terrible idea that was and how much Americans actually hate government shutdowns. And this cycle repeats itself very often. So it was fun to see Elon Musk encounter it as a neophyte, having never experienced how the sequence of events unfolds. But his heart was in the right place. He didn't execute his goals. He didn't achieve his goals, and he didn't execute them in a very adroit fashion. But he experienced what conservatives experience in sort of a speed run, a microcosm, where all the energy and enthusiasm is behind cutting the budget. And then once you get to Washington, you find out that every constituency gets a say, and every constituency is deeply invested in every single dollar the government spends. And it's very difficult to cut spending in Washington.
Indeed, as he's found out. It'll be even more fun, Noah, to watch the dynamic between Mr. Musk and Mr. Trump in the months ahead. I fear it's not going to repair itself